All right, come and take your seats, please. We are going to begin. Let's pray. Father, tonight I want to pray for us. God, I want to pray that as we are growing in our knowledge of these things, we wouldn't use them to puff ourselves up. That's a persistent warning in Scripture, right? That we can easily fall into the trap of, as we become smarter, we end up puffing ourselves up. But that's not showing the love of Christ. And that's not revealing the gospel, the good news of God working in each one of us. So, Lord, I'm asking that as we continue through this class, and as we gain knowledge, I pray that it would be in step with your Spirit, and that we wouldn't use it to puff ourselves up, but we would use our knowledge rightfully to serve people and to love them better, to take responsibility in our life and to love people around us better, to use our knowledge in true wisdom, empowered by your Spirit, to show not how amazing we are, God, but how amazing you are. I pray that this would be true for us as we continue on this evening as we continue on with this class. I pray this in Jesus' name. Have your way, Lord. Amen. All right, tonight we are talking about the objectivity of morality. Now, this is also going to be one of our arguments for the existence of God. And one of the interesting things about this one is what we're going to look at tonight has proven to be one of the most effective contemporary arguments for the existence of God in apologetics, especially among kind of college-age students. Millennial and Gen Z specifically, those kind of two generations, tend to be very persuaded by the moral argument for God. Now, you might be wondering, well, how would objective morality amount to persuasiveness to millennials and Gen Z? I mean, aren't they all about the subjectivity of morality, right? Like moral relativism. What's good for you is good for you. What's good for me is good for me. Here's the truth, okay? What my generation and younger tends to do is we tend to give lip service to relativism, but we don't believe it. We don't believe it. Millennials and Gen Z are highly committed to the objectivity of morality. Highly committed to things like tolerance, to things like love, to propositions like racism is wrong, or war is bad. These kind of statements, or how about the equality of humanity, or the intrinsic value of each person? These are things that millennials and Gen Z, that the younger generations hold to perhaps more than anything else. And so they give lip service to the subjectivity of morality when they're talking about maybe things like sex and how they express themselves. But the truth is, I mean, they really just inherited that from the boomers, from the hippies. I mean, we just inherited that from the hippies. Free love and self-expression, all that kind of stuff. That was basically inherited from the boomers. But we are highly committed to the objectivity of certain moral propositions that, more than anything, some of these millennials and Gen Zers will give their life for. And there's this weird kind of incoherence that exists in the minds, and I would say in the hearts, of a lot of people in my generation and younger, where, again, we give this lip service to subjectivity, but in reality we deeply believe in the objectivity of morality. And what we've found is that, especially among like high school, college age, if you appeal to the objectivity of morality and you show a younger person that they really do believe in objective moral truths, it's a very short jump to get them to belief in God. And that's what we're going to kind of look at tonight. So as usual, turn your attention to the screen and we'll continue in just a moment.
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, The existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
Okay, so this brings us to our argument from morality. He just went over it in the video, but I'll go over it again here. Premise 1, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Now, this is an logically ironclad argument. This is actually following the second rule of logic that we went over, which was modus tollens. In an if-then statement, right? If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. That's modus tollens. We had modus ponens and then modus tollens. This is a modus tollens argument. So P is God does not exist. Q is objective moral values and duties do not exist. We're negating Q. So a negation of a negation is what? A positive. So we say objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore not P. So we negate the God doesn't exist and we get God exists. Okay, this is logically ironclad, but as usual we need to show the truth of the premises. And that's what we'll be doing tonight, as we have been doing in recent weeks. So the argument for morality. Does anyone have just a brief question, or if there was something unclear about the argument itself? We'll define some of these terms here. What do we mean by objective or subjective? What do we mean by values or duties? We'll define that in a moment. But do you have any questions just on the form of the argument or what the argument is trying to communicate? Okay, move on ahead then. So defining the terms. Okay. When we say objective, we mean that something is independent of a person's opinion. It's mind independent. So if everyone in the world believed otherwise, an objective truth would still be true. Even if the whole world believed 2 + 2 = 5, it wouldn't. It would still equal 4 because it's mind independent, right? Likewise, if the Germans had won World War II and the whole world were Nazis right now, if we were all brainwashed, we were all conquered by Germans, and everyone was a Nazi, it wouldn't change the fact that the Holocaust was still evil, objectively. That's what we mean by objective. Okay? Subjective, it's dependent upon people's opinions. It's mind dependent. So it's something like, I think in the video they talked about ice cream, right? I prefer vanilla. But is that a statement of objective truth? Like vanilla is the best ice cream? Some might argue that. No, but it's not. It's just a subjective opinion. Right? The source of the truth is in me, not in the ice cream itself. It's in the subject, not in the object. So it's mind dependent. So what is a moral value? Think of it like a valuation or an assessment. When we talk about moral values, we're talking about, is something good or bad? Is something good or bad? When we talk about duties, though, we're not just talking about is something good or bad. We're talking about should you do something? What is your obligation? What action should you take? In other words, what is right or wrong in any given circumstance? And the reason we make these separate is because you can think of instances where something is good, but it's not obligatory. Like, becoming a doctor would be a good thing, even a morally good thing. Choosing to use your skills and life and mind to serve other people, to help other people, right? That would be a good thing, but it doesn't mean then we're obligated to all be doctors. So the value is different than the duty. Likewise, you can think of situations where all you're presented with are bad options. But it's still your moral duty to choose the right one. So I'll give like an extreme example, okay? I thought of this one when I was just kind of processing through the content. Say I was sat down, I had been abducted by terrorists, and I was sat down in a chair, bound to it and all this stuff, and they put two buttons in front of me. One was like, you push this button and you die, right? And the other one was, you push this button and we launch a nuke into Minneapolis. And if you don't push any button, we'll launch the nuke into Minneapolis. Okay. All morally bad options, right? Two nuking places, obviously. The first one, committing suicide. I would be committing suicide. I would be pushing the button, choosing to die, right? Also morally bad. But there is a right choice. What is it? Pushing the first button. Yeah, right. And we all recognize that. So our moral duty demands that we kill ourselves in that situation to save, even though they're all assessed as bad options. So this is why we divide this up and we make a distinction between a moral value and a moral duty. Continuing on. So let's look at our first premise here. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. So as Christians, we believe that our moral obligations and moral assessments of things are grounded in God's nature. That it's God who gives the grounding for morality. But if God didn't exist, in other words, if atheism was true, what would that mean? That's what we're looking at here. Go on to the next slide. Before we get into it, though, we want to address, if you are talking with anyone about this argument, I guarantee you this is going to come up, okay? Common misunderstanding. Here's what we are not saying through this argument, okay? We are not saying belief in God is necessary for moral action. I'm sure we all know people that do not believe in God and have done morally upright things, right? But we are not saying that belief in God is necessary for good action. 1 second, I just got a message here that the mic is off. I don't think so. I'm seeing the audio move here on our screen. Check 1, 2. Yeah, no, the audio is working. So it must be, whoever that was, it must be your laptop or your computer. So just maybe unmute your sound. Okay. Let's get back to this then. Common misunderstanding. We're not saying that you have to believe in God in order to do a good thing. Okay, that's not what we're saying. We aren't saying belief in God is necessary to recognize morality. In other words, we think someone who doesn't believe in God could still recognize this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. We're not saying belief in God is necessary to formulate a system of civilized ethics, as if you can't all come together and come to some common understanding of what should be ethical in our society if you don't believe in God. It's possible to do this, right? It's possible to do this. Romans 2:14 and 15 says this: "For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them." This is Paul talking about how every human being has been given a moral sense from God, right? And so that even those who don't have special revelation of what God's moral ideals are, still has some innate sense, imperfect as it may be, still have some innate sense as to what is right and wrong. So we are not saying you have to be a believer in God in order to do good things. What we're saying is, actually, frankly, it's stronger than that. What we're saying is that the existence of God is necessary for morality to exist at all. In other words, if it's possible, if it is even true to call something good or bad, then it's necessary that God exists. That's the claim we're making. That's the claim we're making. It's a strong claim, but I think we can substantiate it tonight. So, if God does not exist, atheism is true. The most common account we would have then would be that we came about through a kind of an undirected evolutionary process, right, with no kind of superintender, no kind of supervisor, but just through pure natural processes at play, we were produced. Well, what would that mean? That would mean that human beings are nothing but a byproduct of nature running its course, right? Human beings are nothing but a byproduct of chance and natural laws functioning mind independently over and over and over again through millennia until life comes on the scene and eventually you and I. But we are just byproducts of nature. There's no design. There's no fine-tuner trying to give some purpose to this existence. There's no telos in Greek or like end goal to any of this. There is just natural laws chugging away and we happen to pop out. Okay, but what would that mean? It would mean that human beings have no intrinsic moral worth. We're a happy accident. You know, we're cool. Like, ooh, human beings are interesting, certainly. Lots to learn, lots to figure out. But there's no intrinsic moral value here. We couldn't say something like, we believe these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal. Okay, there's no creator. There's no equality. Why would I not be considered more important, better, than, say, a mentally handicapped person? I am a functioning member of human society. I have a mind that works most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. I have physical capacity to do things. Why in the world would anyone think that on atheism I would be equal to someone who is wheelchair bound and who doesn't have their full cognitive capacities? Why would anyone on atheism think that we are equal? Humanity has no intrinsic moral worth. In fact, on atheism, I would go even further and say such a person perhaps is just using up resources and is a waste of breath. On atheism, obviously I don't believe this. We're just a byproduct of nature. We have no objective moral worth. Our moral sensibilities have simply evolved to confer survivability to our species. So we do have a moral sense. All of us have some kind of a moral sense. That's undeniable. We experience that. We are abhorred by stories of like Hamas raping all these women, right? We saw a lot of that's recently come out. Some of the details around that, and we read that and we're horrified by it. Or like, you know, stories of children being abused and murdered and blah, blah, blah. We hear these kinds of things and like we have a moral sensibility about it. But if atheism is true, then all that is is our highly developed, evolved mind that is aimed toward survival. Why am I abhorred by these things? Well, because they don't lend to human survival. They don't lend to human flourishing. If we weren't abhorred by children being killed, then how would we propagate the next generation? How would we bring about, would we ensure the safety of the next generation? Right? If we weren't abhorred by civilization breaking down and people just kind of doing whatever they want, well, then we would never be able to band together to have greater survivability. But that's all it is. That's all it is. Evolution has given us this sensibility to ensure that we don't die out. Right and wrong become nothing but subjective impressions. I just don't like this thing, and you don't like that thing. But you know what? Hey, maybe I hate humanity. Maybe I don't like our species, and I want to blow up the world, right? I'm like a mad scientist, and I want to end it all. Who are you to tell me I'm wrong objectively? You can tell me how much you hate me. You can tell me how much you don't like what I'm wanting to do or what I'm trying to do. You can tell me how repulsed you are by it, but that's as far as you can go. You have nothing that gives you an objective ability to judge my actions as wrong. Wrong says who? This is what I want to do with my life. Wrong says who? If I can get away with it, who cares? I'll blow up the world and go live on the moon and live out the end of my days in solitude and joy over what I have done. On atheism, objective morality is not possible. Next slide. Oh, but human flourishing is good. Human flourishing is so good. This is called humanism. And in fact, most atheists will also call themselves a humanist. I am an atheistic humanist. In other words, I don't believe in God, but I believe that we should make humanity flourish. Okay? I actually have been playing this video game recently where in the game world there's this organization called the Enlightened. And they're an organization of atheists who do charitable and benevolent endeavors. So they like open up, food shelves, and they hold like, they try to get people out of addictions, and they form communities for young children, all this kind of stuff. And they're working toward human flourishing. Well, when you start studying philosophy and you start thinking deeply about things in life just start to kind of bug you. So I'm playing this game and I'm listening to this whole enlightened thing, and I'm just like, do you guys know how incoherent you are? How baseless your ideals and your works of generosity are? Like, do you even understand? Anyway, but it's just a video game. Who cares? But I mean, this isn't just a video game. It's real life. I mean, people do this. Humanism, this is the cry of humanism. This is the symbol for humanism, by the way. Human flourishing is good. Why? Why do you think human flourishing is good? On atheism, all this is an arbitrary, totally arbitrary, you have no good reason for this, arbitrary form of speciesism. Not racism, speciesism. In fact, if you listen enough to animal rights activists, Greenpeace, this kind of stuff, you'll hear this word thrown around, speciesism. Oh, human beings are no more valuable than a cat, no more valuable than a dog, no more valuable than fill in the blank, so you can't do things that harm these other species, right? Well, guess what? On atheism, that's completely true. On atheism, we are no more valuable than a dog or a cat. We're more intelligent. We're more evolved, but that doesn't mean that we have some kind of greater intrinsic value. If atheism is true, then humanism is just an arbitrary form of speciesism. And someone who goes against the flourishing of humanity who goes against this kind of herd morality is not doing anything objectively wrong. They're just being unfashionable. So what if Hitler wants to elevate the Aryan race and put everyone else down under his boot and have that be the ones who flourish? Who are you to tell him he's wrong? In fact, if he won, then it would probably just be a sign that you're not as evolved as him and you should have gone to the wayside anyway. Right? They're the super race. They're the more evolved ones. It's just unfashionable. Hitler becomes someone you can't condemn. You can just say, well, he didn't follow the popular consensus. That's as far as you can go on atheism. Next slide. Our friend Richard Dawkins, who we've talked about a couple times now, one of the most famous atheists, this is from his book, River Out of Eden, A Darwinian View of Life. He says, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And that is the most consistent atheistic view. At least he's honest enough to say it. I am less irritated by people like Richard Dawkins, who at least understand the implication of his idea, versus people who are like, I am an atheistic humanist, and I pioneer human flourishing. Why? Like, on your worldview, why should you do this? Or the college kid who's raging against racism, who's raging against inequality or inequity, that's the popular word to use these days, who's raging against, you can't tell me homosexuality is wrong. Where is the foundation of what you're saying? Like, on your own worldview, why are these things bad? If you don't believe in God, you have no ground to say people have value. You have no ground to say, I can't just do what I want to do, even if it means oppressing you. You have no ground to say any of this. It just blows my mind how people don't see this. Some do. Frankly, some do. I think in our secular culture, some intelligent, quiet people see the incoherence of the schools teaching a secular worldview and also trying to teach that they should respect their teachers and classmates. You can't get there. You can't have a secular worldview and also teach you should respect teachers and classmates. And I think some kids are wise up to the system and understand that doesn't make any sense. Because if nothing is holding me accountable, if there's no such thing as an objective standard of morality, why should I have to respect you? Questions, comments, anything at this point? Yeah. So So you're just showing us, you're just saying that if somebody had a strong evolutionary kind of view of things like we've been going over, you would just point them further back to like the design argument, like we talked about, the fine-tuning argument, right? Absolutely. I'd encourage you to do that. I will just be clear about this. This isn't an argument against evolution. This is an argument against evolution without God. If it's not if evolution is true. That I'm not arguing for. I'm simply arguing that if there's no God, then the most common idea would be, well, we evolved through random chance and blind natural processes. That doesn't get us to value. That doesn't get us to worth. That doesn't get us to morality. Right? I just want to be clear. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah. The question is, if you are an atheist and you believe in evolution, how would you have a conscience? Well, we'll get there, actually. We're going to deal with what's called the sociobiological account of morality. And that comes later in tonight's presentation, so we'll get there. Good question. Anything else? Yeah. The question is, did Richard Dawkins finally admit that there must be a God? He's not dead. Oh, you asked before he died. He's not dead. No, he has not changed his views. Although I saw a recent interview with him within the last year where he was talking with Francis Collins, who is the head of the Human Genome Project, a strong believer, one of the most significant scientists of the last 100 years. And he's also I don't have to go into his whole thing, but he was talking with Richard Dawkins like within the last year. Because Francis Collins wrote a book about why he became a believer, why he became a Christian. And Dawkins read his book, and they were having a dialogue about it. But Dawkins admitted that the fine-tuning argument has him scratching his head, which I thought was pretty interesting, which is what we just went over the last couple weeks. Okay, let's keep going here. So what would be another account of morality if it's not God? Could there be another account of morality? Well, some atheists have appealed to what's called moral Platonism. Moral Platonism. I'll just break this down really briefly. Platonism comes from Plato, the philosopher, right? And not the thing you play with, the little clay you play with, not Play-Doh, Plato, the philosopher. And he basically proposed that he was trying to solve the problem of universals. So I'll give an example here. You're sitting in a blue chair, right? I have blue pants on. But they're not the same, are they? If I put my pants next to the blue chair, they're not the same shade. There's obvious differences in my pants. So Plato is kind of like, why do we all have this sense of, say, blueness when none of us ever actually observe, like, true blueness, right? We observe things that sort of resemble each other, but what about that ideal thing, like blue as an ideal? And he proposed that blueness, this is just my example. I'm not saying Plato was fascinated by blue chairs, okay? That's not what I'm saying. I'm just giving an example here. He basically proposed that blue must actually exist, but it doesn't exist in the real world, in the physical world. It exists in the world of ideals or the Platonic realm, okay? This was the idea. And this was basically, he says, everything like this exists. For we all say human, but we're all totally different. We're all so different, but we have this conception of like human as an ideal. He says that really exists, but in this ethereal realm called the Platonic realm, or the realm of ideals, ideal objects, or abstract objects, or abstract entities. And then through some mysterious process, when a human is produced, the ideal of human supervenes, it's a special philosophical technical word, upon the actual physical object of the person, and then we all observe it. Human. Okay. Really weird. Okay, but this has been a highly debated philosophical concept for a long time. Platonism versus nominalism, okay? Some atheists have tried to say, well, moral values and duties, moral values do exist objectively in a Platonic realm. So they're not found in God, but they're found in the realm of ideals. So humility really exists as some ideal object, as some abstract entity. Love really exists. Service really exists. Tenderness really exists, right? And they exist as these abstract ideals. They're not grounded in God. They're grounded in this ether realm, okay? I know it's weird, but this is actually not as uncommon as you might think it is. Here's a couple questions for the moral Platonist, okay? How does that result in our having moral duties? In other words, even if I granted that moral values all really exist in some ideal place, how does that put a demand on me? Why do I have to align with the good moral values instead of the bad ones? What is causing me from not being able to align with, say, pride instead of humility? Nothing. There's nothing in the world of ideals that is dictating to me what I must do. So I could, instead of align with the ideal of humility, I could align with the ideal of pride, or violence instead of peace, or pick your poison, right? So how does this translate to duty? That isn't clear at all. Secondly, abstract entities are not causal. They don't cause anything. This is a core tenet of Platonism. They exist in a separate realm, and they have no causal effect on the world. If they're not causal, why would we think that evolution would cause us to align with certain ones over others? Like, cause us to align with the good ones instead of the bad ones. I could think of a lot of bad moral values that would confer survivability to me. Like, if I was very violent, potentially, like if I was very strong and apt to violence, it could lead to my demise, but I think it also could lead to my survivability in certain contexts, right? We think of like apex predators, right? Very survivable because they are at the top of the food chain. They eat everything else, right? So like you can think of moral values that would be what we call evil that would give us survival instincts. Even just selfishness would help me survive, right? To a certain extent, perhaps. I might need to have some kind of tribal thinking in there, but we can imagine these things, right? So why would evolution correspond with moral goodness instead of anything else on an atheistic moral Platonist view? These are questions. Not super important that you kind of got the fullness of that, but this is an idea that is out there, how atheists try to ground morality without appealing to God. Questions there? Okay, move on then. Another argument against grounding morality in God is called the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, this is from Plato as well, but he wrote about the dialogues of Socrates. We know about Socrates' life through Plato. Plato teaches us about Socrates. Socrates didn't leave any written works of his own behind. And in Plato's dialogue, Socrates is having a conversation with a man named Euthyphro. And he asks this question. He says, is the pious, or in other words, like the good, loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Now, we can kind of reinterpret this for our modern day and ask a different question. Ask the same question, but differently. Does God will something because it is good, or is something good because God wills it? This is called the Euthyphro dilemma. Now, the reason it's a dilemma is because either of these options destroy your conception of God. See, if it's God wills something because it's good, then that means that God is subject to goodness. He's below goodness. Goodness exists outside of him and stands over him as something God has to subject himself to, and therefore he's not sovereign in a God-like sense. Okay? So that would be a problem. But secondly, if the latter, if something is something good because God wills it, like is it just good because God said so, then it makes morality arbitrary. Then all of a sudden, morality is not grounded really in anything. It's just God going, I'm going to call that good and that bad. I'm going to call that good and that bad. And we just make morality arbitrary and kind of worthless, right? Because then God could say, child abuse is good, and that will make it good. Or Nazism is the right path, and that will make it the right path, just because God said so. And so it becomes arbitrary, and it means God is arbitrary. And so we don't want to go down either of these paths. So this is a classical objection to grounding morality in God. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma, but here's the key. It's a false dilemma. There's actually a third option. So you can go on to the next slide. God wills something because he is good. It's not he wills it because it is good. It's not he wills it, therefore it is good because he wills it. It's he wills something because he is good. Whatever is consistent with his own nature, that is what he wills. And by answering the objection in this way, we get around the Euthyphro dilemma, and we show, I actually think this is a more biblical concept anyway, that God is by nature, like this is who he is. And I've shared this even in sermons before in church, where I've talked about how God is the grounding of goodness. And so whenever we look at something, we say, that's good. What we're really saying is, that looks like God. That's what we're saying. That's a good thing. What we're really saying is, that is a kind of a godly thing. That's a godlike thing. You see someone helping an elderly woman across the street, you go, that's good. Why? Because it resembles who God is. See, the goodness is grounded in God's own nature. And then his will is an outflow of who he is. So when he says, love your neighbor as yourself, right? It's an outflow of his own nature, which is love. The greatest commandment, love God, love others. Outflow of his own nature, which is love. And grounding morality like this in God avoids the Euthyphro problem, and actually I think is a more biblical perspective anyway. Questions or comments there? If anything wasn't clear, I'd like to be able to clarify it. God grounds it. He is good. It's in his own nature. So that is our evidence for the evening for the first premise. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. I think we've established that. We're going to move on then to the second premise tonight. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Okay? They do. They really do exist. And the first appeal we have, go on to the next slide, is our moral experience. Our moral experience. I've said this multiple times, we all have a moral sense. Some call it a conscience, We all have some kind of moral sense of the world. We hear about babies being abused by their parents or left to die in the cold, and we all get indignant. Right? We have this moral sense. Well, this moral sense forms in us belief in objective moral values and duties. Remember when we talked about properly basic beliefs? We all have these cognitive faculties that form in us beliefs. It's not even something that we necessarily think through logically. It's just, I see a chair and I immediately form the belief that there's a chair in front of me. I see you guys, I see this, and I immediately form the belief I'm in a classroom, right? I observe these things. We talked about how God, that sensus divinitatis, gives us an immediate awareness of God, forms in us a properly basic belief. Well, we also have moral cognitive faculties. And these things form in us beliefs about morality, like rape and child abuse are evil. Form in us these senses of morality, and it's just as real to us as anything else. Our sense experience gives us this sense of moral reality. We would argue that there's no good reason to doubt the truth of that. Just like there's no good reason for you to doubt that you are actually here, right? Having a listening to Pastor Dave in a class. You have no good reason to doubt that. We would also say you have no good reason to doubt your moral experience, your moral sense. Doesn't mean it's perfect, just like your own cognitive, like your observations of the world aren't perfect. A mirage can, make your eye catch something not quite right. Or, different things can, you see something out of your peripheral vision that isn't really there, right? Or whatever. It's not a statement that our senses are always perfect or they're always right, but they give us a general sense of truth. And we would say the same is true about the moral sense, the moral experience. There's no good reason to doubt the reality of these things. There are those who don't have moral sense. Psychopathy is a real condition where you have lost a cognitive faculty of moral sensibility. Those who don't experience this, though, are impaired. It doesn't mean that just because some people are blind, that the external world therefore doesn't exist. Just because some people have cognitive impairment around morality doesn't mean that morality exists. No, we would just say that there are some individuals that are cognitively impaired. Just like some individuals can't hear, can't see. We have no more reason to deny these things than we have to deny other properly basic beliefs. And the reality is, when pressed, most people will agree to this. Most people will agree to the objectivity of morality. You might be talking with someone, especially a younger crowd, And they might say morality is subjective. But then if you tell them, well, then I think it's good to oppress gay people, they are going to throw a fit. And if you tell them, well, I hate black people, they are going to throw a fit. And if you tell them, fill in the blank, right? Well, I think child abuse is great, they're going to throw a fit. I think the Me Too movement is baloney, and I think we should be allowed to rape women anytime we want. They're going to throw a fit. Why? Because they all have the same moral sense experience that you and I have, and they all believe it's real, just like we believe in the reality of the external world. Most people understand this intuitively, and even if they've been confused about it and have had a whole bunch of double talk in their social lives around this topic, if pressed just a little bit, they realize, I actually believe in objective moral truth. Questions or thoughts? You got something. There you go. There you go.
How can a person, other than war, but still, even with war, I would still have a consciousness of pulling the gun unless I think of it. I don't know.
So Roy just put out the example of you could just pull a gun on them. What are they going to say to that? I actually heard someone share a story about having a conversation with a college student about this very topic. And it was a one-on-one conversation. And the college student continually said, morality is subjective. Morality is subjective. I don't believe in objective morality. Morality is subjective. And the person, they were trying to evangelize them. And the person goes, okay, fine. I'm out of here. See ya. They start walking away. They take the student's wallet and walk out of their dorm room. And they start walking down the hall. Well, the student immediately, of course, runs after them. Hey, you can't take my wallet. The person turns around and goes, why not? Well, because it's wrong. Excuse me? Right? Everyone believes in objective morality. If they say they don't, they are fooling themselves. Right. Or they genuinely don't. Like there are some who genuinely don't, who just bite the bullet that this is all an illusion. And it would be the same as biting the bullet that the external world is just an illusion, you're living in the matrix, right? It's the logical equivalent. And some do, some genuinely just bite the bullet, but then they cannot make claims on other people's decisions and choices. They can't say racism is wrong. They can't say rape is wrong. They can't say child abuse is wrong. And they ultimately are fine with that. That is a severe kind of deception. But we are not like that. Time is it? 8 o'clock. Okay. Let's keep moving on here. We'll finish up. So we're trying to establish that objective moral values and duties do exist. Now what about, you brought this up, what about the socio-biological account of morality? The objection goes like this: because our sense of morality comes from biological evolution and social conditioning, it is illusory. It is an illusion. These are some of those people that would agree with what I just said, that you can't say racism is wrong, you can't say murder is wrong, you know, these things. They would just bite the bullet. You're right. There is no objective standard of morality because we are just evolved apes, and this all did just come about for survival instinct, and there's no objective truth behind it. So the claim would be then objective moral values and duties do not exist, right? This would be the claim. I want to go to first of all, like this assumes that atheism is true. Right? So this argument that okay, objective moral values and duties don't exist because we're all just evolved primates. It all just comes about through social conditioning and evolution. That assumes that atheism is true. Because look at it this way. If God exists and evolution is true, I know you may not believe that. That's fine. I'm just trying to argue something here, okay? If God exists and evolution is true, then that wouldn't necessarily be the case. God could still give us a moral sense that coincides with truth. God could still give us a true the moral duties and values could still be objective, rooted in God, even with evolution being the way that we come to know these things. Right? So this assumes atheism. It could be that God uses evolution and social conditioning to get us to a point of moral awareness. Right? So this assumes atheism. Also, this commits the genetic fallacy. Sorry, I skipped that one. This commits the genetic fallacy. This is an informal fallacy. We talked about informal fallacies. Usually goes something like this. You only believe that because you grew up, say, in this place at this time in history. Okay, so something like, you might hear it like, you only believe democracy is the best form of government because you grew up in the United States in the 21st century, or something like that. And the idea is, because of how you obtained the belief is obviously false. But that's not true. That's called the genetic fallacy. It's an informal fallacy. That's simply not true. How you obtain beliefs doesn't say whether they're true or not. You could obtain your belief from a fortune cookie. Doesn't mean whether it's true or not. Maybe you learned 2 + 2 = 4 from a fortune cookie. Okay? It'd be a stupid place to learn it, but hey, you learned a true thing, right? 2 + 2 really does equal 4. The genetic fallacy is a informal fallacy. And so this tries to show, because we learned it from evolution and social conditioning, therefore it can't be real. But again, that only is true if atheism is true. We used that argument, but only on the basis that atheism was true. If God exists, then he could use evolution and social conditioning to teach us true moral things. Lastly, this whole argument is self-defeating. For on naturalism, all our beliefs are formed through evolution and social conditioning. And if the person believes that that should mean that we don't trust them, well, then they shouldn't trust any of their beliefs, including their belief about evolution and social conditioning. So we keep getting into these self-defeating circular arguments, right? We keep showing these one by one. Last slide. Well, if objective moral values and duties exist, why don't people agree about morality? I'm sure you've heard this. If it's so objective as you say, why don't people agree about morality? This is a picture of child sacrifice to Moloch, right? Okay. Obviously, there's been significant differences between people groups at different times in history when it comes to what is moral and what isn't. Here's the thing, though. This is what most people don't understand and don't appreciate. Significant differences in how morality plays out can be traced to different external belief systems, not different intuitions. I'll give an example of this. Tribalism, where you protect your own tribe, but you murder all the other tribes around you. That may appear like it is a disregard for the moral imperative that we shouldn't murder, right? But that isn't actually how that forms in a tribal culture. A tribal culture affirms murder is wrong. They just don't believe any other tribe is actually human. Do you see? Same thing with cannibalism. Cannibalism, especially when it's like a violent form of cannibalism, this is usually due to the fact that a tribe or a group of people believe that these others are not actually human. They're just animals. So it's perverted, it's wrong, it's evil, but it doesn't come because we have differing intuitions. We all believe murder is wrong. It's just the external belief systems that have been taught to us condition how we live out those intuitions. So Moloch, for example, here, right? Now we look at this and we go, oh, horrendous, disgusting. And it is. I'm not saying it isn't. It absolutely is. But what are these people trying to do in cultures where they're committing something like child sacrifice? They have a belief system that tells them that if they don't do this, the gods will be angry and maybe they won't send rain. Maybe they'll wipe out our crops and they'll send plagues if we don't make child sacrifices. So ultimately, what this ends up being is an intuition, a moral intuition, that I need to take care of my community. And one of the ways I can best take care of my community is by offering up my own child. Do you see this? It's a perversion. It's wicked. It's evil. I'm not saying this isn't disgusting. What I'm simply saying, though, is people often don't understand moral sensibilities are very universal. But differing external beliefs change how those sensibilities are played out. So in this culture, I have a sensibility that I want to take care of my fellow man, but I think I have to do that by killing my child. Do you see? This is why God is so jealous in the Bible about proper worship. Do not worship other gods. Do not conform to the ways of these other nations. Look, they have rationalization behind why they're doing it. They can rationalize their sin away. They can say, well, I'm really just trying to look out for my neighbor by offering up my child in sacrifice. But God goes, no, you need to worship me alone because otherwise you're going to end up in all these perversions, right? But God has written his law on the heart of every human. And so a lot of these situations where we look and we go, how could any human being think that that is okay? We don't understand that there's a deeper moral intuition there, and they're deceived by something more superficial on top of it. Does that make sense? Humanity generally has a very similar perspective on what is moral and what is not. Or like think about marriage, right? People throughout time have had different ideas about maybe how many wives or how a family should look. But throughout history, human beings have all, you can see it consistently, we've generally had this idea that you shouldn't just be allowed to have anyone you want. Even if you think one culture thinks they can have 3 spouses and another culture thinks they can only have 1, everyone kind of agrees you shouldn't just have anyone you want. There has to be some kind of a commitment here to one another, right? These are the things I'm talking about. I'm not saying they aren't perversions. They are. They're wicked. They're evil. But what I'm trying to show is that they're not as other than we might think they are. But some people generally do have just impaired moral faculties, right? Like a psychopath. And I do agree with Romans 1 that as people commit more and more sin, their moral faculties are more and more eroded, and God gives them over to those debased ideas and lusts and all that, desires and all that jazz. So people don't agree, but I think there's good reason why they don't agree, and it doesn't show at all that there is an objective morality. So therefore, God exists. He's the only grounding for objective morality. There is no other way to ground morals in an objective way where it is mind independent. Even if the whole world had become Nazis and we were all brainwashed and we were all Nazis today, the Holocaust would still be evil. The only way to get there is if God exists. And it is true that the Holocaust is evil, regardless of who thinks it isn't. Therefore, God exists. So we come to the end of our moral argument. And this is not my favorite argument for the existence of God. I don't think it's the best argument for the existence of God. But for whatever reason, at the time we're living in, the culture we're living in, this is one of the most effective arguments for God's existence among millennials and Gen Z, like my age and younger. So it's a good thing to contemplate, to think about, and to learn to share with others. It's 8:13. Any parting shots? Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yep. You're just reiterating that concept of there's this underlying morality to even heinous acts. Yeah. Yep. Not always, but I would say when we're talking about groups, nations, cultures, normally you can find that. With a specific individual who might be just completely mentally, like his sense of morality is just gone, you might find no moral justification whatsoever. But that again, I would just acknowledge that as a mental impairment, and a result of sin and the fall. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Yeah. Absolutely. When you think about tribalism, you think about some of the tribalism within Islam today and some of the things going on with Israel and Gaza. Look at it this way. Again, this isn't justifying anything because it's still sin and wicked and evil. But if it were true that God desired terrorism or something, right? Then it would obligate us to be terrorists. He doesn't, because he is good, and we all from our moral sensibility know that that isn't a good thing, right? So I'm not saying that there's any chance that God is going to command us to become terrorists or anything like that. But what I am saying is there is a fundamental there's a fundamental morality to, say, an Islamic terrorist, where they recognize the greatest obligation on my life is to obey God. Right? And that is a true intuition. Then they have an external system put on them, namely Islam, that directs what that looks like, and it does lead to evil. I think the Quran does teach, well, I don't think so. The Quran does teach violence against non-believers. And so then they go, well, I know my moral intuition that I am meant to obey God. this is how I am meant to obey God, therefore I do this horrendous evil thing. But again, this is why God says, worship me. Don't allow anything else to pervert this, right? Worship me and me alone. But even in that situation, I'm just trying to show that there is an underlying moral intuition there that's true, even if the manifestation of it is false. Yeah. Yeah, Gene.
Isn't there like two Qurans? There's that way out left one where you kill everybody, and then the Quran that is like more like the Bible?
Are there two Qurans, is the question. There aren't two Qurans, but there are. So the Quran teaches violence. I don't think you can get around that. Initially, in early parts of the Quran, because the Quran develops over Muhammad's life, Muhammad originally thought he was going to be accepted amongst Jews and Christians as a prophet. And so initially, in his early days of writing, he was very favorable toward Jews and Christians and basically called them brothers. When he found that he was rejected by Jews and Christians and called heretic and wicked, he became more and more anti-Jew and Christian until by the end of his life he was having all-out offensive warfare against Jews and Christians. And so the Quran follows that exact timeline and trajectory. The Quran goes from a good view of Jews and Christians to kill them all. I mean, that is kind of the trajectory of the Quran. That being said, the majority of Muslims, especially Muslims that you come across, don't believe in violence against Jews and Christians. Just like the majority of Christians you come across don't believe our own Bible. Right? So there are a lot of, I would just say they're nominal. I would just say they're not true Muslims. I would just say they're not being consistent to their own beliefs. But most of them don't want violence. The ones that are radical, that are people like Hamas, I think they are the most consistent Muslims in the world because they're actually following the teachings of the Quran and the Hadith, which allows for the rape of prisoners of war. The Hadith are the sayings of Muhammad's life, and explicitly in their most reliable Hadith, Muhammad tells his soldiers, yes, go ahead, take the women that we have captured, use them for your sexual release. They come to him and they ask him, like, what can we do? We're far from our wives. And he, yeah, go ahead, take them, use them for their sexual release. They ask him, should we pull out? Like, should we spill our semen on the ground? And he says, oh, no, don't worry about it. Just have your way with them and we'll sell them when we get a chance to. That's the Hadith. Their most reliable Hadith teach these things. So I think people like Hamas are the most consistent of Muslims. That being said, most Muslims, just like most Christians, don't believe the Bible, don't believe the Quran. And so they don't practice what it teaches. And so you have nominal Muslims, which are most of the Muslims you come across, and most of them are peace-loving people. But does Islam teach violence? Absolutely, Islam teaches violence. Yeah. Okay. Just want to remind everyone, donations are always appreciated. And let me pray, and we will close for the evening. It is 8:20. I apologize. Father in heaven, help us to use this in our lives. Help us to use this with friends and family. Help us to use this, God, with college students, with millennials and Gen Z. God, so many millennials and Gen Zers are so passionate about justice. They're so passionate about morality. But they just need to know, God, that it's sourced in you, and therefore it's you who says what is good and what isn't. It's a manifestation of who you are, your very nature. So, Lord, I pray that we would be able to show them that. not in pride, not in puffed up arrogance, but in gentleness and respect. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a wonderful evening. You are dismissed. Goodbye, everyone online.